Hey guys, while I'm doing some cleaning up the stones after doing some sharpening and making some videos, I just wanted to talk to you and give you a 101 level class about sharpening stones to help you guys out. I hear a lot of comments about sharpening. People watch videos, they see the technique, they try it, they end up with a dull knife. And that can be explained entirely by your choice of stones. So what we're going to do is go through this real quick, and after this video you should know, between this and technique, everything you need to sharpen things absolutely razor sharp. Now there are two kinds of stones out there that are available to you: natural and man-made. This black Arkansas is a natural, which basically is stone that's quarried from the ground, cut into shape, and sent on its way. Then you have a man-made stone, like this combination India stone, where they take basically an abrasive material, like in this case it's aluminum oxide, and they bind it together with a adhesive and make it into a bar for you to use as a sharpener. So the easiest, of course, are your man-mades. They're really expensive, they're not very common, so we don't have to say a ton about them. The only ones you're really going to find here in America that are really affordable for your average guy are the Arkansas stones. And these are my three Arkansas, and they come in different grades. Now, like I said, these are natural stones, they're not man-made. These are a stone that's quarried out and cut. You have a soft, a hard, and a black. Now, you look up, there's more grades than this, but this is basically a coarse, medium, and like an ultra fine grade. So they same use as an oil stone. You're going to lubricate them with either water or oil or whatever it is you use. And the cool thing about natural stones is because they're not held together with an adhesive, they do give a better edge, a more polished edge. It's actual stone, so it tends to polish more than cut the steel. So you really tend to, when you use Arkansas stones, get a really nice refined polished edge, and it does last a little bit longer than the man-made stones, because those man-made stones are grits held together by adhesive, so it tends to leave little tiny serrations on the edge, little microscopic serrations, which isn't as strong an edge as a nice smooth polished edge. So good Arkansas stones can definitely be the way to go. And your soft ones are going to be like 600-800 grit. Your hards are going to be like 800, 1,000, and these blacks can be like in the neighborhood of 1,500. Of course, that's just a rudimentary number. The big thing that's important is the actual hardness, because these have to be hard enough to actually cut, and the grit kind of determines how small a scratches it leaves in the steel and all that. So having a couple Arkansas is definitely a good idea. They are really good for your end finish. Lots of times many people prefer to start with a man-made stone and then finish with the natural Arkansas stones. Everything here was relatively cheap. The only expensive one was this black stone, which was about 15 bucks. But these other ones were very inexpensive. Now, man-made stones. There's a couple different kinds, and we're going to talk about all of them. First is your silicone carbide, which they're often referred to, and this is where people get confused because they have a million names for everything when it comes to sharpening. You'll hear carborundum, and you'll hear let me grab this box over here. You'll hear carborundum, and the other term you're going to hear is crystolone. Those are silicon carbide. They are a very hard material. It's actually, the same thing a lot of sandpaper is made out of, believe it or not. Because it has to be tougher than the metal in order to remove metal. It has to be, you remember the whole high school or science thing, it's got to be tougher. Silicon carbide is very hard, and it's also very coarse. It comes in like a coarse, medium, fine stones, but really your coarses tend to be like 150 grit, your fine tend to be maybe like 300. They are not anywhere close to a fine polish. They are a rudimentary sharpening. They're not meant to put a polish on a stone. They're not meant to do any of that. They're great starters. This one here is a silicon carbide. It's a small pocket stone. Usually they have a gray or a dark gray color to them. They usually have, you can feel them. They have a pretty coarse grit to them. You will definitely know when you hold them, because compared to something like this, is a lot smoother. Whole different feel to it. So silicon carbide, like I said, those are your stones. Those tend to be your bench stones. Those tend to be the ones you find at Home Depot, the dual grit stones. They tend to usually be like a coarse and a fine grit. And like I said, there's really an elite, like you're talking 150 to 300 grit. It's not nearly enough to get your knife sharp. Yeah, it'll put an edge on it, but it's not going to make it sharp. So they're a small piece of the puzzle. You should always have a silicon carbide stone to keep around for when your knife needs major reprofiling. It has nicks, it rolled, something like that. That's what they're useful for. Next are your India stone. India stone is aluminum oxide and usually are brown in color. They can be brown, I think a couple other, maybe a really light gray, but primarily you see them and you're going to see them as brown. Aluminum oxide is much softer than silicon carbide, but it's a really good cutter. It cuts metal very well and it comes out a little bit finer than your silicon carbide. You're talking neck and neck here, guys. Your India stone's coarse is going to be like around 200. Fines are going to be more like 400 or 500. So you have an extra 100. They're definitely a little more, the grit's a little finer, but they're not as hard. So they tend to cut steel really well, but they're a little faster, I think, because they're a finer grit. But if you do have a really super hard steel, if you're using one of the really fantastic high-end stainless steels, an India stone may not cut it, or at least may not cut it well, because it is softer than the silicon carbide. So that is one important thing to note. You're going to find the India stones in multiple names as well. You hear them referred to as corundum, not to be confused with the carborundum. I know this is why everyone gets so confused. And some just label them as aluminum oxide, like these cheap Chinese stones. These things here, they're just labeled as aluminum oxide. They're an India stone. They come in different grits. And like I said, they're good for softer steels and all that, for that first run of the knife. If I have a knife that's moderately dull, usually I will hit it with an India stone first and then move on to Arkansas. That's kind of my way to go, and that's the way a lot of the world works. A lot of the world will take a stone, hit it up with a fine India, which you're talking 400 or 500 grit, move on to maybe a hard Arkansas, and then finish with the black. Now, one important thing to note, and this is where a lot of people get confused as well, you really got to look up and look at a chart. This fine India and this soft Arkansas are about the same grit. So what happens is people think, oh, this is coarse, so I'm going to start with this and then move up to this fine, and it should be an improvement. But it's not. They're actually the same grit. Even though this is a coarse for Arkansas, it's at the same level as a fine for aluminum oxide. So that's an important thing to know. You got to make sure when you're picking out your stones that the grits, just because it's labeled as coarse, medium, or fine, doesn't mean that those grits line up with the other stones out there. Real quick to note as well, water stones, which are really the popular rage right now, are India stones. They're made of aluminum oxide. They're made a little bit differently. They're made with a much softer adhesive for the block. They're a man-made stone, and basically the difference is one uses a really hard adhesive, one uses a really soft adhesive. So the water stones are more porous. They take on the water, and they wear down a lot quicker too, because that adhesive is softer. So water stones do need a lot more work. They have to be lapped to be cut flat. I don't like them personally. Some people love them. I mean, I don't get it. I definitely understand, but they also leave a very serrated edge on your blade. Yes, they're very fast cutting. They get your edge sharp really quick, but they do leave serrations on your edge, which is not the strongest edge. And your water stones, you're going to see anywhere from like 200 grit up to like 10,000 grit. There's a huge range in those, so that is important to note. And while we're on the topic, we're going to talk wet stone versus water stone. A wet stone and water stone often get confused, and there is a difference. A wet stone is really an oil stone, or what's referred to as an oil stone. Everything you see here is an oil stone. Everything. They're meant to be used with either water, oil, or some other material as lubrication. They don't need to be soaked. Water stones, on the other hand, need to be soaked. Now, why would you call one wet and one water? Well, wet, W-H-E-T, means to sharpen. So it's a sharpening stone. People get that confused, so I did want to point it out. Anything that's labeled as an oil stone or a wet stone, W-H-E-T, you need to use oil or some kind of lubricant. Water stones, you only use water. So people do get kind of confused, and wanted to point it out. You can use water as a lubricant on these wet stones or oil stones, but not vice versa. You can't use oil on a water stone. So we've talked about silicon carbide, aluminum oxide. We've talked about the natural Arkansas stones, and those are made of novaculite, by the way, in case you're looking for everything you need here. And last thing I guess we'll talk about are a little bit more about setting up the proper stones. Now, typically you're not going to find really super fine silicon carbide stones. I've just never seen high grit stones out there. I don't know why they make them, but you can substitute with sandpaper. So if you do want to use 1,000 grit silicon carbide, get yourself some wet dry sandpaper. Now, on the other hand, the aluminum oxide India stones, it's very common to find these in 1,000, 3,000, 5,000, 8,000 grit, available for relatively cheap too, especially when they're coming out of China. So the big thing when it comes to sharpening is making sure, like I said, that you have the proper lineup of grits. You can't use these stones just in any combination and expect good results. Now, for example, say I use the coarse side of this India stone and to start my edge out. You're talking, I don't know, 150, 200 grit there. Boom. I move over to this 300 grit. Bam. Boom. I do it. I try stropping the knife. I don't get a razor edge. Hey, what gives? Well, you need to go higher than that. You need much higher than 300 grit. So lots of times, you're going to want to start with something like this that's in that, 300-400 grit. And lots of times you can jump. You don't need to make every increment. Switch over to this 1,000 grit side. Hit it up on that. Flip this over. Hit it on the 3,000 side. And then from there, maybe hit it up on your black surgical, and then maybe a light stropping. So it's important to always be moving up in your grits and understand. Where people, like I said, get confused is people will go and say, start out with the India at like 300. Maybe they go to a 1,500 grit stone like this, and then they go to the soft Arkansas, which actually dulls the knife at that point and kind of reverses their progress. Because I think the Arkansas, oh geez, it's got to be a higher grit. No. So you just have to be careful and plan this stuff out. And look it up, guys. Google the stone grits, and you can look up, there's tons of charts out there that tell you the grits of individual stones so that you have an idea and know what you're doing. But just, I know it's tough because lots of times these little dual grit stones don't have much as far as labeling on them. You get them at yard sales and you don't really know. You can generally assume that they're 500 grit or lower. And to get a really successful edge on a blade, you really need to be going to 1,000 grit at a minimum. I like around 3,000. 3,000 to me gives a very good edge that lasts a long time. So for me, depending on what kind of steel I'm using and all that, it may be as simple as hitting it up on this 1 and 3 and then stropping it, or hitting it up with this, then 1 and 3, then stropping. But if it's a knife, that's maybe I want a really polished, nice, long-lasting edge on it, I might hit it up with the Arkansas. It really depends on what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. When it comes to stainless steels, I do tend to use the Arkansas. I think I get a little better results with them, but maybe that's just me. Maybe it's just the way I do things, whatever. But it's real important just to make sure, like I said, that you're using the right kind of stones. It's completely okay to mix and match. 90% of the world, you know, not nowadays, but back in the day, when when people did this as a normal part of their lives, would very much start with a stone like this, you know, hit their 100 grit side, their 200 grit side, and then they would finish off with an Arkansas. That was very, very common for back in the day for people to have 3 stones and to do this. And nowadays, of course, we have much better options because we have stones up to 10,000 grit that we can do it. So sometimes it can be odd and awkward going from, okay, is this 3,000 grit, where does this fall in line with the Arkansas? And that can definitely be confusing. But like I said, there's charts out there. Just look it up. Make sure you're doing good. Don't be dulling your knives. And that's another thing too, is when you get your knife and you're checking it, if your knife cuts paper, you do not need a stone like this. Do not. You will just dull your knife. Typically what I've found is that knives start to take hair after a sharpening on about a 600 to 1,000 grit stone. So if your knife's pulling hair, you're going to have to go above 1,000 really to get anywhere with that stone. Or you're going to have to use a polishing stone, kind of like the black Arkansas. Now paper, on the other hand, seems to cut. You can cut paper after like maybe a 300 grit stone. You'll cut it, it's not going to be the best cut. So if your stone still cuts paper, you can very easily just give it a quick touch up on, you know, maybe your fine India and move on from there. It's really kind of a judgment call, but don't spend a lot of time with these coarse things because you're just going to dull the knife and then start over, and you're losing all that steel. You're wasting your time. You know, like oftentimes if a knife is still reasonably sharp, if it can cut paper a little bit, generally you can just touch it up real quick on a 1,000, 3,000, or a couple of the high-end Arkansas, and just drop it for a couple of minutes and you'll be back to sharp. The big thing is keeping up the maintenance, keeping up the upkeep as you go along, as opposed to letting these things get super, super dull. So I hope that all helped, guys. You know, I know it's very intimidating with all the different kinds of stones out there, and you have, of course, the new market, the used market, and nobody really labels these things very well anyway. So I know the whole thing can be a complete nightmare.